The morning sun cast long shadows across the military training facility as Sergeant Marcus "Ghost" Thompson stepped off the transport truck. His worn combat boots touched the dusty ground with the quiet confidence of a man who had walked through hell and lived to tell about it. At 42, Marcus carried himself with the measured gait of someone who had learned that survival often depended on moving deliberately rather than quickly. The other soldiers around him were younger, their uniforms crisp and their faces bright with the kind of eagerness that only came from never having seen real combat. They belonged to the 75th Ranger Regiment, one of the Army's most elite units, and they knew it. Their chests puffed with pride as they unloaded their gear, talking loudly about their recent training exercises and upcoming deployments. Marcus pulled his duffel bag from the truck and slung it over his shoulder. The bag was old, patched in several places, and bore the faded insignia of units that most of these Rangers had only read about in military history books. He had been assigned to this unit temporarily, a veteran instructor brought in to help with advanced marksmanship training. The Army had a way of shuffling experienced soldiers around where they were needed most. As he walked toward the barracks, Marcus overheard snippets of conversation from a group of Rangers gathered near the equipment shed. They were examining various weapons, their voices carrying the kind of confidence that bordered on arrogance. "Look at this antique," one of them said, holding up a rifle that Marcus recognized immediately. It was an M24 sniper weapon system, the same type he had carried through 2 tours in Afghanistan. The soldier speaking was Staff Sergeant Jake Morrison, a tall, lean man with sharp features and cold blue eyes. Morrison had a reputation for being one of the best marksmen in the unit, and he never let anyone forget it. "Who still uses this old junk?" Morrison continued, running his finger along the rifle's stock with obvious disdain. "This thing belongs in a museum, not on a modern battlefield." The other Rangers laughed, gathering around to examine the weapon. Corporal Danny Rivers, a stocky young man with a New York accent, shook his head in disbelief. "My grandfather probably used something like this in Vietnam. Can you imagine trying to hit anything with this piece of history?" Private First Class Tony Valdez, barely 20 years old, picked up the rifle and pretended to aim it. "I bet my smartphone has better targeting technology than this thing. How did anyone ever hit anything beyond 100 meters with equipment this primitive?" Marcus continued walking, his expression neutral, but something tightened in his chest. That rifle had saved his life more times than he could count. He had made shots with weapons exactly like it that these young soldiers would never believe possible, but he said nothing, simply continued toward his assigned quarters. The next morning brought the first day of advanced training. Marcus found himself assigned to work with Morrison's squad on long-range precision shooting. The training range stretched out across a vast expanse of desert terrain, with targets placed at various distances from 500 to 1,200 meters. It was designed to challenge even the most skilled marksmen. Morrison and his team arrived at the range with their state-of-the-art equipment. They carried M2010 enhanced sniper rifles, complete with advanced optics, laser rangefinders, and ballistic computers. Each weapon represented the cutting edge of military technology, capable of incredible accuracy in the right hands. "All right, old-timer," Morrison said as he approached Marcus, his tone carrying a mixture of curiosity and condescension. "We've heard you're supposed to teach us something about shooting. Hope you can keep up with modern techniques." Marcus simply nodded, setting down his rifle case. When he opened it, several of the Rangers gathered around, their expressions shifting from curiosity to amusement. Inside was the same type of M24 they had been mocking the day before. But this one showed even more signs of wear. The stock bore scratches and dings from countless missions, and the metal showed the patina that only came from years of careful maintenance and heavy use. Rivers let out a low whistle. "Sarge, with all due respect, that thing looks like it survived both world wars. Are you sure it's safe to fire?" Valdez elbowed his buddy and whispered, just loud enough for Marcus to hear, Maybe he's planning to throw it at the targets, might be more accurate than actually shooting it. The laughter that followed was not entirely cruel, but it carried the unmistakable tone of young soldiers who believed they knew everything about their profession. They had trained with the best equipment, learned from qualified instructors, and excelled in controlled environments. In their minds, outdated equipment was a sign of outdated skills. Marcus began his equipment check with the methodical precision that had kept him alive in places where mistakes meant death. He examined every component of his rifle, from the bolt to the trigger mechanism, checking tolerances and function with the practiced eye of a true craftsman. The Rangers watched with growing impatience, clearly eager to get to the actual shooting portion of the training. "Is he going to inspect that thing all day?" Morrison muttered to his squad. "We could have already engaged 3 targets in the time he spent checking one ancient rifle." The morning progressed with standard exercises at closer ranges. Morrison and his team performed admirably, hitting targets at 600 and 800 meters with impressive consistency. Their modern equipment worked flawlessly, and their training showed in every shot. They moved with practiced efficiency, calling out wind speed, range, and elevation adjustments with the confidence of soldiers who trusted their technology completely. Marcus took his turns quietly, saying little but hitting his targets with steady reliability. His shots weren't flashy, but they found their marks with the kind of consistency that spoke to thousands of hours of practice. Still, the Rangers seemed unimpressed. After all, hitting static targets at known distances was basic training for soldiers of their caliber. During the lunch break, the conversation turned to real-world shooting scenarios. Morrison regaled the group with stories from his recent deployment, describing shots he had made and targets he had eliminated. His tales grew more elaborate with each telling, and his squad hung on every word. "The thing about modern warfare," Morrison explained, gesturing with his sandwich, "is that you need equipment that can keep up with the pace of operations. You can't afford to rely on obsolete gear when lives are on the line. Technology gives us the edge." Valdez nodded enthusiastically. "Exactly. Why struggle with manual calculations when your rifle can do the math for you? It's like choosing to use a slide rule when you have a computer." Marcus ate his meal in silence, listening to the young soldiers debate the merits of various weapon systems and electronic aids. He remembered having similar conversations when he was their age, before he learned that the most sophisticated equipment in the world couldn't replace experience, intuition, and the ability to adapt when technology failed. As the afternoon training session began, the range officer announced that they would be attempting shots at extended ranges. Targets were placed at 1,200, 1,500, and 1,800 meters. Distances that would challenge even the most advanced equipment. The wind was picking up, adding an additional layer of difficulty to an already demanding exercise. Morrison's squad stepped up first, their confidence evident as they prepared for the long-range shots. They set up their equipment with practiced efficiency, using their electronic systems to calculate range, wind speed, and atmospheric conditions. The first few shots at 1,200 meters went well, with most of the team achieving hits or near misses. As the range increased, however, the challenges mounted. At 1,500 meters, the electronic systems began to struggle with the complex wind patterns that swirled across the desert terrain. Several shots went wide, and the Rangers found themselves making multiple adjustments to their equipment. "These conditions are ridiculous," Rivers complained after missing his 3rd consecutive shot at 1,500 meters. "The wind keeps shifting faster than the computer can calculate corrections." Morrison was faring better than his squad mates, but even he was having difficulty with the extreme range shots. His 1,800-meter attempts fell short or drifted wide, despite the best efforts of his advanced targeting systems. "Maybe the targets are too far out for today's conditions," Valdez suggested, frustration evident in his voice. "Even our equipment has limits." The range officer, a grizzled master sergeant named Williams, shook his head. The conditions are well within acceptable parameters for this exercise. Sometimes you have to work with what you're given. As Morrison's squad finished their attempts at the longest range, they gathered their equipment with obvious disappointment. They had expected their superior technology to overcome the challenging conditions, but the desert had proven to be an unforgiving teacher. "All right, Thompson," Williams called out. "You're up for the long-range attempts. Think that museum piece of yours can reach out to 1,800 meters?" The Rangers turned to watch, their expressions mixing skepticism with curiosity. They had seen Marcus shoot competently at shorter ranges, but 1,800 meters was a different challenge entirely. At that distance, even a small miscalculation could send a shot yards wide of its intended target. Marcus approached the firing line with the same calm demeanor he had maintained throughout the day. He set up his rifle with deliberate care, making minute adjustments to his position and equipment. Unlike the Rangers with their electronic aids, Marcus relied on tools that would have been familiar to snipers from decades past. A simple rangefinder, a wind meter, and most importantly, his own experience reading the environment around him. The desert afternoon had brought shifting winds that danced across the terrain in complex patterns. While the Rangers had struggled with wind speeds that seemed to change by the second, Marcus spent several minutes simply observing. He watched the way grass moved at different distances, noted how dust devils formed and dissipated, and felt the subtle pressure changes that indicated wind direction shifts. The Rangers gathered behind him, their earlier mockery replaced by genuine curiosity. They had never seen anyone spend so much time preparing for a single shot, especially without the aid of computerized systems. "What's he doing back there?" Rivers whispered to Morrison. "My rifle could have already calculated everything he's trying to figure out manually." Morrison watched intently as Marcus made small adjustments to his scope, each movement precise and purposeful. There was something about the veteran's complete focus that commanded respect, even from soldiers who questioned his methods. Master Sergeant Williams called out the range. 1,800 meters, single shot. Target is the standard silhouette. Marcus settled into his firing position, his body conforming to the ground with the natural ease of someone who had done this thousands of times before. The rifle seemed to become an extension of himself as he acquired his sight picture, his breathing automatically falling into the rhythm that every sniper learned, but few truly mastered. The desert fell silent around them, as if the landscape itself was holding its breath. Even the wind seemed to pause for a moment, creating a pocket of stillness in the vast expanse of sand and scrub brush. Marcus's finger moved to the trigger, applying pressure with the same steady control that had served him through countless missions. The shot, when it came, was a sharp crack that echoed across the range, followed by a silence that seemed to stretch on forever. All eyes turned toward the distant target, barely visible even through powerful spotting scopes. The range officer's voice came through the radio, calm and professional. "Perfect center mass hit. Textbook shot." The Rangers stood in stunned silence, their earlier confidence shaken by what they had just witnessed. Morrison lowered his binoculars slowly, his expression unreadable as he processed what had happened. Marcus began cleaning his rifle with the same methodical care he had shown throughout the day, seemingly unaffected by the perfect shot he had just made. To him, it was simply another day at work, another problem solved with skill developed over years of practice and application. The silence stretched on until Valdez finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. How did he do that with that old rifle? The question hung in the air like the dust stirred up by the desert wind, and for the first time that day, none of the Rangers had a confident answer to offer. The evening air in the barracks was thick with tension and whispered conversations. Word of Marcus's impossible shot had spread through the unit like wildfire, creating ripples of disbelief and grudging respect among soldiers who had spent the day questioning his methods and equipment. The Rangers gathered in small groups, their voices low as they tried to make sense of what they had witnessed. Morrison sat on his bunk, meticulously cleaning his own rifle for the third time that evening. His movements were sharp and precise, betraying the frustration that simmered beneath his calm exterior. As one of the unit's top marksmen, he had built his reputation on consistent performance with the best equipment the military could provide. The idea that someone had outperformed him using what he considered obsolete gear challenged everything he believed about modern warfare. It had to be luck, Rivers said, setting down his gear with more force than necessary. Nobody makes that shot in those conditions without electronic assistance. The wind was changing every few seconds. Valdez nodded eagerly, desperate to find a logical explanation that would restore his confidence in technology. Maybe the wind just happened to be perfect at the exact moment he fired. Timing like that happens once in a lifetime. But even as they spoke, doubt crept into their voices. They had all seen enough combat and training to recognize the difference between skill and chance. Marcus's shot had been too clean, too precise, too controlled to be attributed to mere luck. Corporal Sarah Chen, a newer member of the squad who had remained quiet during the day's events, finally spoke up. Did anyone else notice how long he spent reading the environment? He wasn't just guessing about the wind patterns. Morrison looked up from his rifle, his jaw tight. Environmental reading is fine for basic shooting, but at 1,800 meters, you need computational assistance. The variables are too complex for mental calculation. Are they? Chen asked quietly. My grandfather fought in Korea. He used to tell me stories about shots his spotter made with equipment that makes Sergeant Thompson's rifle look modern. Maybe we've gotten too dependent on our electronics. The suggestion hung in the air like an unwelcome truth. These Rangers had trained with the assumption that technology was always the answer, that advancement in equipment naturally translated to advancement in capability. The idea that a soldier with older gear might outperform them challenged the foundation of their military identity. Meanwhile, Marcus sat alone on his bunk at the far end of the barracks, writing in a worn leather journal. It was a habit he had developed during his first deployment, a way of processing the day's events and maintaining connection with home. The journal contained no military secrets, just personal observations and letters to a family that waited for him thousands of miles away. He was aware of the conversations around him, but chose not to engage. He had seen this reaction before, in other units and other training exercises. Young soldiers often struggled to reconcile their faith in technology with the reality that warfare was still, fundamentally, a human endeavor. No amount of electronic assistance could replace experience, intuition, and the ability to perform under pressure. The next morning brought a new challenge. Master Sergeant Williams had planned a field exercise designed to test the Rangers' ability to operate in realistic conditions. Instead of the controlled environment of the shooting range, they would be working in rough terrain with moving targets and time constraints. The exercise area was a series of hills and valleys that simulated the kind of environment where precision shooters often found themselves in actual combat. Targets would appear at unknown distances and remain visible for limited periods, requiring shooters to acquire, range, and engage quickly while maintaining accuracy. Morrison's squad prepared their equipment with the confidence that had characterized their approach throughout training. Their rifles were loaded with the latest ammunition, their scopes calibrated to perfection, and their electronic systems updated with the most current atmospheric data. Today, we show him what modern soldiers can do, Morrison told his team as they prepared to move out. Yesterday was a fluke. In realistic conditions, proper equipment makes all the difference. Marcus checked his gear with the same methodical approach he brought to everything else. His rifle might have been older, but every component was perfectly maintained and individually tested. More importantly, he carried something that couldn't be measured or calibrated, thousands of hours of experience in exactly these kinds of conditions. The first phase of the exercise took place in rolling hills covered with sparse vegetation. Targets would pop up at random intervals and distances, remaining visible for 30 seconds before disappearing. Each shooter would face 10 targets, with scores based on both accuracy and speed of engagement. Morrison's squad moved into position with tactical precision. Their training showed in every movement as they established firing positions and prepared to engage targets. When the first target appeared at an estimated 600 meters, Morrison acquired it quickly and fired within 15 seconds. The shot was good, hitting the target slightly off-center but well within the acceptable zone. His squad mates performed similarly, their modern equipment allowing them to range targets and make calculations quickly. Their shots were consistently accurate, and their engagement times impressive by any standard. The electronic systems worked flawlessly, providing rapid solutions to complex ballistic problems. Marcus took a different approach. Rather than relying on electronic systems for quick solutions, he spent the initial minutes of the exercise studying the terrain and environmental conditions. He noted wind patterns at different elevations, identified areas where mirage might affect targeting, and mentally cataloged reference points that would help him estimate ranges without electronic assistance. When targets began appearing for Marcus, his engagement process looked almost leisurely compared to the Ranger's rapid-fire approach. He would spot a target, spend several seconds studying the conditions, and then fire a single shot. His hit rate was perfect, but his engagement times were significantly slower than the younger soldiers. "See," Rivers said during a brief break between target presentations. "He's accurate, but he's too slow for modern combat. In a real firefight, those extra seconds could mean the difference between life and death." Morrison nodded, his confidence returning as he watched Marcus's methodical approach. "Precision is important, but speed wins fights. Our equipment gives us both." The second phase of the exercise moved into more challenging terrain, with targets appearing at greater distances and in more difficult environmental conditions. The hills created wind patterns that shifted constantly, and heat shimmer from the rocky surfaces made ranging more difficult. As the conditions became more challenging, the Rangers' electronic systems began to struggle. Wind sensors couldn't keep up with the rapidly changing conditions, and the atmospheric data that had been perfect for the morning's cooler temperatures became less reliable as the day heated up. Morrison found himself missing shots he would have easily made on the range. His rifle's computer provided solutions that were mathematically correct, but failed to account for the subtle environmental factors that affected bullet flight in real-world conditions. "The system keeps giving me solutions that don't work," Valdez complained after missing his third consecutive shot. "The wind data has to be wrong." Chen was having similar problems. Her rifle's ballistic computer provided consistent calculations, but her shots were consistently off target. Maybe the electronic systems aren't designed for this kind of terrain variability. Marcus, meanwhile, continued his methodical approach. He had noticed that the electronic wind sensors were positioned at ground level, where they couldn't detect the different wind patterns that existed at various elevations along the bullet's flight path. Instead, he relied on visual indicators scattered throughout the terrain: grass movement, dust patterns, and the behavior of insects and small animals that were more sensitive to air currents than any electronic sensor. His engagement times remained slower than the Rangers, but his hit rate stayed perfect even as conditions became increasingly difficult. Each shot was fired only after he was completely satisfied with his reading of the environment, and each shot found its mark with mechanical precision. The third and final phase of the exercise took place in a narrow valley where targets appeared at extreme ranges, some beyond 1,500 meters. The terrain created a complex wind environment where electronic systems were virtually useless, their sensors overwhelmed by the chaotic air currents that bounced off rocky surfaces and changed direction constantly. Morrison's squad struggled with the challenging conditions. Their electronic systems provided solutions that seemed reasonable but failed to account for the unique ballistic environment of the valley. Shot after shot fell short, went wide, or was affected by wind conditions that their sensors couldn't detect or predict. Frustration mounted as the Rangers realized that their technological advantages were becoming liabilities in the complex environmental conditions. The very systems they had relied on to provide quick, accurate solutions were providing quick, inaccurate solutions instead. "This is impossible," Rivers muttered after another missed shot. Nobody could consistently hit targets in these conditions. Marcus stepped up to his firing position and began his familiar routine of environmental assessment. He spent nearly 5 minutes studying the valley, watching patterns that were invisible to electronic sensors but clearly apparent to experienced human observation. He noted how wind moved through different parts of the terrain, identified thermal currents rising from sun-heated rocks, and calculated how these factors would affect his shots. His first target appeared at 1650 meters, barely visible even through high-powered optics. The Rangers watched as Marcus settled into his firing position, made minute adjustments based on his reading of the conditions, and fired a single shot. The distant target spun and fell, clearly hit. A second target appeared at an even greater distance, estimated at nearly 1,800 meters. The wind in the valley was gusting unpredictably, and heat shimmer made the target appear to dance in the scope. Marcus again took his time, studying conditions that changed moment by moment, waiting for the precise combination of factors that would allow for an accurate shot. When he finally fired, the bullet seemed to hang in the air forever before finding its mark. Another perfect hit at a distance that should have been impossible under the prevailing conditions. The Rangers stood in stunned silence, their confidence in their technological superiority shattered by repeated demonstrations of human skill overcoming electronic limitations. Their expensive, sophisticated equipment had been outperformed by a combination of experience, observation, and intuition that couldn't be purchased or programmed. Morrison lowered his rifle slowly, his expression a mixture of frustration and growing respect. "How are you doing this? Your equipment is decades old, and you're not using any electronic assistance." Marcus began his post-exercise equipment check, his movements as methodical as always. "Technology is a tool. It can make a good shooter better, but it can't make a poor shooter good. And sometimes, when conditions get complex enough, simple tools work better than complicated ones." He paused in his cleaning and looked directly at Morrison. "Your equipment is excellent and your training is top-notch, but you've learned to depend on systems that work perfectly in perfect conditions. Real combat rarely provides perfect conditions." Valdez shook his head in disbelief. "But how do you make calculations without a ballistic computer? The math is incredibly complex." Marcus smiled slightly, the first time the Rangers had seen him show any emotion beyond calm professionalism. "I'm not doing complex math. I'm reading patterns that I've learned to recognize over thousands of shots in similar conditions. Experience teaches you shortcuts that no computer can calculate." Chen stepped forward, her curiosity overcoming her earlier skepticism. "Could you teach us to read conditions the way you do?" The question surprised Morrison, who had expected his squad to maintain their faith in technological solutions. But as he looked around at his team, he realized that the day's events had fundamentally changed their perspective on the relationship between skill and equipment. Marcus considered the request carefully. Teaching environmental reading was more art than science, requiring patience and practice that many modern soldiers found frustrating. But these Rangers had demonstrated both skill and determination, and their willingness to question their assumptions showed promise. "Environmental reading takes time to learn properly," Marcus said finally. "It's not something you can master in a few training sessions. But if you're serious about improving your capabilities, I can start showing you what to look for." Morrison found himself nodding before he could stop to consider the implications. His pride stung from being outperformed by equipment he had dismissed as obsolete, but his practical nature recognized the value of skills that could enhance his unit's capabilities. The sun was setting as the Rangers gathered around Marcus, their expensive rifles temporarily forgotten as they prepared to learn lessons that no amount of technology could teach. The training facility took on a different atmosphere in the weeks that followed. What had begun as a routine assignment for Marcus became an intensive education for the Rangers, who had initially dismissed his methods. Word of his performance had spread beyond Morrison's squad, drawing curious soldiers from other units who wanted to understand how someone using older equipment could consistently outperform operators with the latest technology. Marcus found himself conducting informal classes during off hours, teaching skills that had never appeared in any manual or training program. He showed the Rangers how to read wind patterns by watching grass movement at different distances, how to detect thermal currents by observing insect behavior, and how to estimate range using reference points and angular measurements that required no electronic assistance. The learning process was humbling for soldiers accustomed to instant answers from their equipment. Environmental reading required patience, observation, and a willingness to spend minutes studying conditions that their electronic systems could analyze in seconds. More challenging still, it required developing intuition about natural patterns that couldn't be reduced to algorithms or formulas. Morrison proved to be one of the most dedicated students, arriving early each morning to practice the observation techniques Marcus had demonstrated. His pride had been wounded by being outperformed, but his professionalism overcame his ego. He recognized that these skills could make his unit more effective, regardless of their impact on his personal standing. "I've been shooting competitively since I was 12, Morrison admitted one evening as he and Marcus reviewed wind patterns on the range. "I always thought I understood ballistics perfectly, but I was just understanding the mathematical part." Marcus nodded, watching the way shadows moved across distant hills as the sun set. "Mathematics is important, but it's only one piece of the puzzle. Your computer can tell you exactly what the wind speed is at the sensor, but it can't tell you what the wind is doing at 800 meters or 1,200 meters, or how it changes between here and the target." Chen had become particularly skilled at reading environmental conditions, her patience and attention to detail serving her well in the new discipline. "It's like learning a new language," she observed. "Everything in the environment is communicating information about conditions, but you have to know how to interpret the signals." Valdez struggled more with the transition from electronic to manual methods. His generation had grown up with digital tools, and the analog approach to problem-solving felt foreign and inefficient. But gradually, he began to understand that efficiency wasn't always the same as effectiveness. The real test came during a joint training exercise with another unit, where Marcus's students would have the opportunity to demonstrate their newly acquired skills under realistic conditions. The exercise simulated a complex counter-terrorism scenario with multiple targets at varying ranges and environmental challenges that would test both technical and observational skills. Morrison's squad prepared differently than they had for previous exercises. While they still carried their advanced equipment and relied on electronic systems for basic calculations, they now supplemented their technological tools with the environmental reading skills Marcus had taught them. The exercise began before dawn in mountainous terrain that created complex wind patterns and challenging shooting conditions. Targets were positioned at ranges from 400 to over 2,000 meters, with some requiring shots across valleys where wind conditions changed dramatically between firing position and target. Other participating units approached the exercise with conventional methods, relying heavily on their electronic systems and standardized procedures. They moved efficiently through their equipment checks and target acquisitions, confident in their technological advantages. Morrison's squad moved more deliberately, taking time to study environmental conditions before engaging targets. Their engagement times were initially slower than other units, but their hit rates were significantly higher. More importantly, they successfully engaged targets that other units missed entirely due to environmental factors their electronic systems couldn't detect or compensate for. The most challenging target was positioned at 2,100 meters across a deep valley where wind conditions were so complex that electronic sensors provided contradictory readings. Multiple units attempted the shot and failed, their bullets affected by wind currents that their equipment couldn't measure or predict. When Morrison's turn came, he spent nearly 10 minutes studying the valley environment. He watched dust patterns, observed vegetation movement at different elevations, and noted thermal effects that created visible distortions in the air. His squad mates provided additional observations, creating a composite picture of environmental conditions that no single sensor could capture. Morrison's shot was perfect, hitting the distant target with an accuracy that surprised even Marcus. The successful engagement demonstrated not just individual skill improvement, but the development of teamwork based on shared understanding of environmental factors. Rivers, who had initially been the most skeptical of Marcus's methods, made a series of exceptional shots using purely observational techniques when his electronic systems malfunctioned during the exercise. His success proved that the skills they had learned weren't just supplements to technology, but genuine alternatives when equipment failed. The exercise concluded with Morrison's squad achieving the highest accuracy scores, despite using older basic equipment combined with observational methods. Other units began asking questions about their techniques, curious about how they had succeeded where more technologically advanced teams had struggled. During the post-exercise debrief, the commanding officer specifically noted the performance of Morrison's squad and asked Marcus to explain his training methods. Word of the results reached higher levels of command, generating interest in incorporating environmental reading skills into standard sniper training programs. But the most significant change was in the attitudes of the Rangers themselves. They no longer saw technology and traditional skills as competing approaches, but as complementary tools that enhanced each other. Their electronic systems provided rapid baseline calculations, while their observational skills allowed them to refine those calculations based on environmental factors no sensor could detect. "We were like pilots who could only fly with autopilot," Chen reflected during one of their final training sessions with Marcus. "Now we can fly manually when we need to, and we understand what the autopilot is actually doing." Marcus prepared to leave the training facility with a sense of satisfaction he hadn't expected when the assignment began. He had come simply to provide instruction in advanced marksmanship, but had ended up teaching something more valuable: the importance of understanding fundamental principles behind technological tools. Morrison approached him on his final day, carrying a package wrapped in military-issue canvas. Inside was a custom-made rifle case, crafted by the unit's armorer using materials from decommissioned equipment. Engraved on a small brass plate were the words, "To SGT Thompson, technology serves the warrior, not the other way around." "We wanted you to have something that represents what you taught us," Morrison explained. "It's not about the equipment you carry, it's about the skills you bring to bear." The farewell gathering that evening brought together Rangers from multiple units, all eager to hear stories from the veteran who had challenged their assumptions about modern warfare. Marcus shared tales from his deployments, emphasizing how survival often depended on adaptability, observation, and the ability to perform when sophisticated equipment failed. "Every tool has limitations," he told the assembled soldiers. "The key is knowing what those limitations are and having alternatives when you reach them. Technology is incredible, but it's not magic. It's most effective when operated by people who understand the principles behind what they're doing." Valdez raised his hand, his expression serious. "What happens when we deploy? Will we be able to maintain these skills without constant practice?" Marcus smiled, recognizing the question as a sign of genuine understanding. "Skills fade without practice, just like physical fitness deteriorates without exercise. But once you learn to see environmental patterns, You'll notice them everywhere. Every day provides opportunities to practice observation and environmental reading. As the evening concluded and soldiers began returning to their quarters, Morrison lingered to speak privately with Marcus. "I owe you an apology," he said quietly. "When you arrived, I judged you based on your equipment rather than your capabilities. I made assumptions that were both wrong and unfair." Marcus shook his head. "No apology necessary. Confidence is important for soldiers, and questioning new approaches is natural. The fact that you were willing to learn when presented with evidence shows real professionalism." The next morning, Marcus boarded the transport truck that would take him to his next assignment. As the vehicle pulled away from the training facility, he watched through the rear window as Morrison's squad conducted morning practice on the range. They moved with the same precision and confidence they had always shown, but now their approach incorporated both technological tools and observational skills in equal measure. Several months later, Marcus received a letter from Morrison describing their unit's deployment to a mountainous region where electronic systems frequently malfunctioned due to extreme weather conditions. The environmental reading skills they had learned proved invaluable, allowing them to maintain operational effectiveness when their technological advantages were neutralized. The letter included a photograph of the squad in their operational environment with a handwritten note on the back. "Ghost, your lessons saved lives. The old ways still matter. Semper Fi. Morrison's Rangers." Marcus placed the photograph in his worn journal, next to similar mementos from other units and other lessons learned. Each image represented soldiers who had discovered that true expertise came not from mastering equipment, but from understanding the fundamental principles that made effective shooting possible under any conditions. The military's ongoing evolution toward technological advancement was inevitable and largely beneficial. But Marcus had helped ensure that a new generation of warriors understood the importance of human skills that no amount of sophistication could replace. They had learned that the most advanced weapon system was useless in the hands of someone who couldn't adapt when conditions exceeded the parameters their technology was designed to handle. Years of experience had taught Marcus that warfare would always be fundamentally human, regardless of technological advances. Machines could provide information and enhance capabilities, but victory ultimately depended on individuals who could think, adapt, and perform under pressure. The Rangers he had trained now carried that understanding with them, making them more effective soldiers and more complete warriors. The training facility continued its mission of preparing elite soldiers for combat, but with a new appreciation for the balance between technological capability and human skill. Future classes would learn both cutting-edge techniques and time-tested fundamentals, ensuring that American warriors remained adaptable and effective regardless of the challenges they might face. Marcus's legacy lived on in every shot, fired by soldiers who had learned to read the wind, every successful engagement made possible by observational skills no computer could replicate, and every mission completed by warriors who understood that true expertise transcended the tools they carried into battle.